first, we start with the pipeline fight between BC and Alberta. The breaking news on this one this morning, the Assembly of First Nations, just a short time ago in Ottawa, this is the major Indigenous rights group in Canada, just passed an emergency resolution condemning the pipeline deal between Ottawa and Alberta and calling for the immediate withdrawal of the agreement. Of course, BC Premier David Eby and his government continuing to fight for that oil tanker ban off the coast of BC. Yeah, this pipeline fight is really heating up. Let's discuss it now with my guest, John Rustad, Leader of the Opposition at the Legislature in Victoria, Leader of the Conservative Party of British Columbia. John, thank you very much for coming on today.
Mike, as always, thanks for having me on.
I appreciate it a lot. So let's start with that breaking news there this morning. The Assembly of First Nations, this is the major Indigenous rights group in the country, saying hell no to this pipeline. They want the deal canceled immediately. Your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I'm pretty sure that you're going to end up seeing quite a few First Nations actually supporting this project. But the real question is, this is Canada. This is British Columbia. Are we elected governments making decisions on behalf of all the people in this province and in this country, or are we going to be governed, for example, in British Columbia by 204 First Nations? Now, First Nations are important. They need to be engaged. They need to be respected. If we got Section 35 of the Constitution, all of that, is true and needs to be dealt with. But at the end of the day, even the Supreme Court of Canada has said Canada and British Columbia have the ability to move forward projects that are in the interest of the people, and a pipeline from Alberta through to the BC coast to prevent us from having to subsidize the Americans to the tune of $50 million plus a day is just the right thing to do.
Okay, so there's been a lot of talk that there will be an Indigenous ownership stake in this pipeline here. In fact, Alberta Premier Danielle Smyth just said that it could be majority Indigenous owned. So you've got Indigenous communities are split on this, right? They're divided.
So it's interesting because I actually think the majority of the First Nations that are actually along the pipeline route are probably, interested, engaging and having conversations about it. And it's the ones that are not along the route that are the ones that are opposed. A few years ago, there was a project called Eagle Spirit, which had all the First Nations lined up to move oil from Alberta through to Prince Rupert. So I suspect there is going to be support, and we'll see what Danielle Smith and Mark Carney, our Prime Minister, decide to do in this. I did find it interesting that Mark Carney says that he will invite BC to be at the table with the discussions with First Nations. I find that, it's pretty incredible to think that British Columbia wouldn't be taking the lead on those negotiations like I did when I was minister, negotiating for the pipeline agreements for the projects that were in British Columbia.
Okay, well, speaking of the pipeline and British Columbia, let's talk about David Eby's position on this, right? So Eby has now been very highly critical of this project, says it jeopardizes our economy, jeopardizes our environment. And he said something interesting the other day, though, that he wants to keep that tanker ban in place. Now, this is a federal ban on oil tankers off the north coast of BC, and he wants to keep that ban in place. But then he also said, well, maybe we can talk about a pipeline as long as the tanker ban is still there. So let's play that clip and I'll get your thoughts.
If we can agree that the oil tanker ban is going to stay in place, then let's have those conversations. I think that would make life a lot better and easier in British Columbia in terms of our relationship with coastal First Nations, and we definitely take down the temperature.
Okay, how can you have a pipeline and a tanker ban? Like, it seems to me that's like building an airport with no runways. It just doesn't make sense. What your thought?
I'm sorry, I'm chuckling at that because, this seems to be David Eby's idea of the economy. Oh, we'll let something happen, but not really. And so it's crazy to think that he would be flip-flopping around on this. Or maybe he's got some other route in mind. Maybe it's a project that doesn't have a proponent, that's going to have taxpayer money spent on it, that doesn't have a specific route, that isn't really a project. Isn't that what he said about the Northern Line? He said, no, we can't do that in British Columbia. And now he's saying maybe he should do that. I mean, this guy is going, literally, he's going to be buying out flip-flops this Christmas. You won't be able to find them. Go out and get them because he's going to go out there and make sure that everybody around him is provided with these things. Okay. How he's doing this dance. It's unbelievable.
All right. What is your position on this? We should be gung-ho on this pipeline and get behind it 100%, right?
My position is really simple on this. Enough of subsidizing the Americans. Right? Let's take our Canadian resources, move them to international markets. Let's get the true value for it so that we as Canadians can all prosper from this. We're selling our natural gas to the Americans at an 85% discount. We're selling our oil at a 20 to 30% discount, $50 million or more every single day. We're just giving to the Americans because we can't get our products to market. Enough of this nonsense. Let's do it.
The other thing that Eby has said frequently is that this pipeline, if it would go through, because it's opposed by the coastal First Nations, and I take your point that a lot of First Nations will support it, but the coastal First Nations, where the terminal would be, are opposed to it. They've made that pretty clear. And he says that because of that, they would withdraw their support for billions of dollars of other projects like liquefied natural gas or port expansion. Are you buying that?
No, I'm not
argument?
buying that at all. That's you see this from governments and the fear-mongering and misleading statements. None of that is true. I've talked to many First Nations, the projects that are going forward. This sort of thing, an oil pipeline is a blip on the radar in terms of all the other projects that need to be done. But here's the catch. I'm pretty confident, and I don't know this for a fact, but I'm pretty confident that Daniel Smyth and Mark Carney would not be proposing a pipeline if they didn't have in mind where it would terminate to be able to export. And so there's got to be some agreements. There's got to be some discussions going on at a high level in terms of this. Remember, when the Eagle Spirit project was being proposed a number of years ago, Indigenous-led, there was Coastal First Nation that wanted to host the export terminal of oil. And so the Coastal First Nation group himself is not representing all Coastal First Nations in British Columbia. It's a group that is put forward that, quite frankly, doesn't necessarily represent those interests of all the other nations that are involved in these type of projects.